Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Life Show. Happy Monday, everybody. Happy, hopefully, the week of your fantasy football championship. Obviously, still got some Monday night madness to sort through there. But yeah, it is truly a great day to be great. And accordingly, I am thrilled today to be going to go over 10 of the most telling stats from the last week of action and, just generally talk a lot of good ball along the way. However, I cannot accomplish this alone. And accordingly, I am joined by Fantasy Life's finest, Chris Allen and Paul Charchian. Paul, my goodness, the Minnesota Vikings control their own destiny in a season that was seemingly left for dead. Wow, good job.
Yeah, nobody more shocked than we are here in Minnesota, and suddenly we're trying to decide, should we make Sam Darnold the highest paid quarterback in the league? That's the conversation that's happening here in Minnesota, and this is what happens when you win. We on 10 straight? I think we're on 10 straight games here in Minnesota. We're losing track right now. Control our own destiny, but it will be tricky. Coming up next week, Green Bay, then at Detroit. So if the Vikings do get to that number one seed, they will have earned it.
Meanwhile, Chris sitting pretty in lovely Cincinnati, Cincy Vegas, as we like to call it. No one really calls it that. But Bengals, basically, no margin for error. They need to win their last two games, and they're also going to need a little bit of help. How are we feeling? I know you've given up on this year a little bit before, but come on, you're getting a little bit excited now.
I'm always excited to see Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins out there on the field together making magic. Of course, and when your quarterback can throw a touchdown when he's almost like parallel to the ground, those are one of those highlights where it's like, hey, man, as long as we get to watch those three out on the field, I'll take it. And I know that they don't have a lot of no margin for error, but still, I mean, these are games that having some excitement this late into the season. I didn't think we'd get that earlier this year. So I'm just happy that, again, we get to go out there and watch them do their thing out there on the field.
Also appreciate Burrow, putting his fantasy managers on his back with that, pretty meaningless bomb touchdown to Jamar Chase with under 2 minutes left. So maybe hurt your squad, maybe helped it, but that's just good old fantasy football for you. But there was actually more recent action we do need to break down, fellas, and that was the Dallas Cowboys coming back with an impressive victory over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 26-24. Cowboys, did cover as 4.5-point dogs. The over did cash here at 47. They were hitting out there, Chris. This felt like a playoff game, which is especially crazy because the Cowboys got eliminated from the playoffs just a few short hours before. So obviously Mike McCarthy has the team playing hard, trying to keep that job. And accordingly, they have now won, I believe, 4 of their last 5 games. So, if your Bengals hadn't taken advantage of that block punt debacle, could be on even a longer winning streak. So really was impressive. Cooper Rush, 292 yards and a BEA. Beautiful touchdown to Jalen Tolbert with Vita Vea about to unalive him. Also had Rico Dowdle, unfortunately, bust. So what did we see from Rico out there, Chris? Because I'm guessing this is the more annoying part of the game that fantasy managers want to hear about.
Yeah, and I think that was the tough part from the Cowboys offense, because to your point, with Cooper Rush looking so well, you would think that the rest of the offense would be clicking around him as well. But with the Bucs being able to push the offensive line or the Cowboys offensive line to the point where they weren't able to create much on the ground, you do have one of those worst outings from Rico Dowdle, especially at a point in the season where fantasy managers were expecting him not just to get the workload, but also have the ability to create those yards that they needed in order to continue on throughout the playoffs. Rico Dowdle, less than 30 yards rushing, still getting over 60% of the carries. And of course, the worst part of it all was Zeke Elliott was the one to get that 1-yard plunge into the end zone. But I would say if you're able to survive this, the usage should allow Rico to still be at least a mid-range-ish RB2. But for everybody else, though, I think if you have CeeDee Lamb, you do have to be concerned about that the shoulder injury that he sustained throughout that game, or re-aggravated rather. I mean, it was middle of the fourth quarter, catches a pass, does his little Tyler Lockett impression of just immediately going down afterwards. It's probably not a good sign for a guy like CeeDee Lamb to have on your roster. But still, if he's active and available, you're probably going to have him on your roster, but I wouldn't be expecting much in Week 17.
Yeah, I mean, Collinsworth was talking on the broadcast about CD, literally telling them that, when he was running with the ball last week, he was more so just concerned with trying not to land on that shoulder. Of course, on that deep, ball he caught last night, unfortunately did get thrown down onto it. So playing through the pain, incredibly tough guy. We'll see what he's able to do next week here against the Philadelphia Eagles and what, should be another NFC East slug fest. So good stuff there. Also, shout out Jake Ferguson, caught 6 of 9 targets for 40 yards. And also keep an eye on Jalen Tolbert. Yes, Yes, he did catch that touchdown. Did seemingly either dislocate his finger or hurt his hand, though. So a couple banged up Cowboys wide receivers. Let's move on to the Buccaneers, though, Charge, because again, maybe, could have used that victory, obviously, but still got 300 plus yards from Baker Mayfield. Had another nice performance from Bucky Irving. Even Rachaad White, when he wasn't fumbling at the end of the game, otherwise put forward a nice effort in the full PPR fantasy box score. So really the only disappointment here was Mike Evans, 69 scoreless yards on 8 targets. Not a bad game, but it's Mike Evans. We always expect him to go nuclear.
Yeah, pretty quiet game, 5 for 69. Mostly was not double teamed in this game, but he suffered from a lot of shadow coverage from Deron Bland, who was playing out of his mind in this game, all over Mike Evans. And Baker did a great job getting the ball to a plethora of targets. 9 different receivers caught passes, 7 receivers caught 2 or more passes. So Evans just not a focal point of this particular game. And Jalen McMillan, what are we seeing right now? A possible baton passing starting from Evans at the tail end of his career to McMillan surging right now. 3 straight big games for Jalen McMillan, each with a top 17 wide receiver finish or better. He was all over the field, getting open. He caught the passes he should catch. McMillan's developed, I think, into a fascinating prospect for next year. Right now, if this continues, I don't know that it's clear who the first Tampa Bay wide receiver you'll be drafting next year is. Is it Chris Godwin coming back off another knee injury? Is it Mike Evans in what will then be his 12th season? Or is it Jalen McMillan, then a sophomore surging at the end of his freshman year? So this is going to be worth watching for sure with Jalen McMillan. Loved what we saw from him. Baker Mayfield was terrific, played with incredible determination and poise. Ian, earlier you said this game felt like a playoff game. It did. Man, these guys, these quarterbacks are slinging, players are getting hit. It was, and Baker was fantastic. I thought threw for 303 yards, 2 scores, ran for another 42 yards, despite being under constant harassment. I thought Baker played a great game. And then possible sea change coming in the backfield for Tampa. Bucky Irving dominating the backfield shares, despite everybody else being healthy. 70% attempt share. That is a season high for Bucky Irving. No other back had more than 3 carries. And as always, Bucky looked good doing it, credited with 4 missed tackles. Now, I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. I don't think it's hot take to say that Bucky Irving is one of the 5 most talented running backs in the league right now. That's not to say one of the 5 highest scoring fantasy backs, just on pure talent. Bucky Irving is among the elite runners in this league.
Hey, I think breaking tackles is probably the best, individual stat we have for running backs right now. And to your point, Charge, he is right up there with guys like Kenneth Walker as the very best in the league. So they get the Panthers to tee off on next week. Obviously, love playing our running backs against that defense. So Bucky Irving, good chance he's cracking our top 12. Rachaad White still not going to be too far behind him in his own right. Again, caught 7 passes out there. So helped you out in full PPR. But Mike Evans chased for 1,000 yards, guys. He needs 182 over these next 2 games. Certainly wouldn't put it past him. That could just be, achieved in one good Sunday at the office over there. So we'll see what goes on there. Last point here, I did want to note Jalen McMillan almost had his 2nd touchdown, 57, and 1 trip to the end zone was cool, but heck of a play by Jordan Lewis on a contested catch too. Basically ripped the ball away at the last second. So last note, Payne Durham, we're playing ahead of Kate Otten, who was sidelined this one. 88% route rate, caught 5 of 7 targets for 29 yards. So first point, Payne is an awesome name for a football player. And second point is just, no, not trusting him as a top 10 option next week. But for those of you in the icky DFS streets, or God forbid you're in a huge league, Payne Durham getting a full-time role in this offense. So that was your Sunday Night Football recap. There are a handful of injuries that we're going to have to monitor throughout this week, guys. We'll remind you throughout, but yes, Jalen Hurts dealing with a concussion ahead of that matchup against the Cowboys. Hopefully he is able to return. Otherwise, will be another addition of Kenny Pickett, who continues to wear 2 gloves for whatever reason. James Conner also dealing with a knee injury. Trey Benson's out with an ankle issue, and Amari DiMercado is on IR. So maybe it's Michael Carter season. Again, plenty more on this situation as we get into the week. Also know Drake London dealing with a hamstring injury, although head coach Raheem Raheem Morris didn't seem overly concerned, which is good. Kenneth Walker dealing with an ankle issue. Now we had Zach Charbonnet dealing with an existing oblique issue coming in. Saw a little bit more Kenny McIntosh than normal, but yeah, if Walker is going to be sidelined, great news for Charbs ahead of week 17. Also, keep an eye on Josh Allen, been playing through a fractured left hand throughout this season and seemed to kind of bang up his right hand / elbow yesterday. So haven't seen anything too alarming, but again, it's Josh Allen, so we will monitor that. Also note George Pickens on track to return for his Christmas Day matchup against the Chiefs per head coach Mike Tomlin. Good news after missing several games with that hamstring injury. Justice Hill, however, dealing with a concussion. Zay Flowers with a shoulder issue. Keep an eye on those. Already talked about the Cowboys. And yes, in Tampa, maybe even more targets on the way for Jalen McMillan because Sterling Shepard with that hamstring injury was not able to finish. Fantastic player intro, though, with his daughters, shouting out Oklahoma as he was, getting announced with the starters. Fun time there. So that was the rapid news. And now, Charge, I'm going to throw it to you because we got some CHOPionship to talk about.
Oh, there we love our guillotine right there.
I missed this one.
Yeah, we do miss the guillotine, don't we? Yeah, that's great. We've got two different guillotine formats coming for the playoffs. For years, you've asked for guillotine leagues in the NFL playoffs. We're giving you two different ways to play. I want to focus today on one we call the CHOPionship. Yes, the CHOPionship. Here's how it works. There is no draft. You just choose your favorite 14 playoff-bound players. The only limitation on that is you can only have 3 players per NFL team. The players you choose will be rostered for the entire playoffs, so you'll not be making any free agency changes, any roster changes. And then where the chopping action comes in, and there's always chopping, after every round, the lowest scoring 25% are out. So you have to plan to make sure that you survive every single round. You can't back end load your roster like you do in a lot of playoff formats. You got to get through week number 1. So that is the CHOPionship. You can register now to reserve a spot. Gameplay opens up right after week number 18 at guillotineleagues.com. That's the CHOPionship.
Again, guillotineleagues.com, guys. Make sure you go to that contest lobby to enter. Favorite personally is the $100 25-person tournament. And yeah, who wouldn't want a little bit more fancy to sweat here as we get into the playoffs. So cannot wait to get into that. We're certainly going to be having some drafts going on between all of us here at Fantasy Life in the upcoming weeks. So in the spirit of the CHOPionship, we're going to go through some of the biggest stats from week 16 and start looking ahead more and more into what we are expecting in the playoffs and then even beyond into 2025. So fellas, let's start things off with the Chiefs, who have now won an NFL record 16 straight one-score games. Charge, which Chiefs would you prioritize in the CHOPionship?
Well, broadly, I'm deprioritizing Chiefs in this format because I got to get through week 1, and they're going to be the number 1 seed. They're not going to play in week 1. And then also, this Chiefs offense, I don't know. I mean, who do you really want to go to war with here? So the only Chiefs that I'm thinking about taking are some guys that would be differentiators, guys that won't be very chalky. Maybe Xavier Worthy, who's seen a massive uptick in usage lately. In the first 10 weeks, Xavier Worthy was averaging 2 catches per game. But since then, weeks 11 to now, he's more than doubled his receptions to up to 5 per game, consecutive games with 11 targets for Xavier Worthy. And even with Hollywood Brown coming back and being out on the field a little more than I thought yesterday, we're still seeing Xavier Worthy starting to be a bigger part of this offense. ADOT is coming down, which is good because Xavier Worthy was just sort of like a vertical, bombs away, low percentage guy. That was very unreliable. They're using now in all parts of the field. I like that for Xavier Worthy. And then maybe the other Chief I'm kind of interested in, and this is just a hunch, really, Isaiah Pacheco, because nobody's going to roster him. He's doing nothing right now. And again, because you can pick anybody, I need a couple of differentiators. Maybe it's Pacheco. He's been in this timeshare with Kareem Hunt, but Hunt's been pretty bad. Maybe they're just keeping Pacheco fresh for their playoff run. Maybe. So I don't know, Pacheco, Worthy, but mostly I don't think I want Chiefs on my CHOPionship roster.
Chiefs have been a little more willing to start featuring their running backs as they've gotten into the playoffs. We've seen guys like Ian Williams, Jerick McKinnon, Kareem Hunt previously start to really get fed the ball once games matter more. I mean, even last year, Pacheco had 70% plus snaps, only 3 regular season games before easily clearing that mark in each of the 4 playoff games. So like that under the radar call charge. Chris, though, I mean, it's crazy to talk about the Chiefs in fantasy and not even come close to mentioning Patrick Mahomes or Travis Kelce. Are we just out on these dudes?
For the most part, because if you can't find because Mahomes hasn't had the scrambling really like added to his game that would allow him to get into the Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, like the hybrid mobile quarterbacks that you would want to have as your QB1 hasn't really been there for him, especially with his ankle injury, although he looked pretty good on Saturday, like running around there for the most part. But either way, if the passing yardage really hasn't been there for him, and if also just the overall like touchdowns have also not been there for him throughout this season, having Patrick Mahomes as your QB1 or even Travis Kelce as your tight end one with so many other options available in the Kansas City Chiefs passing game, I'm kind of with both of y'all. I wouldn't really lean on them as guys to have. Xavier Worthy is really the only wide receiver that you would want to trust if you have to roster them in the CHOPionship, because since week 11, this is now a 6-game sample. No wide receiver has gotten more than 7 targets in a game other than Xavier Worthy. I mean, it's just 4 times a wide receiver has gone over 20% of the team's targets and air yards. And it hasn't really been one that we would want to use from a fantasy standpoint. So yeah, maybe throw a dart at Isaiah Pacheco because they want to get him going through the playoffs. Throw a dart at Xavier Worthy as a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end 3, somewhere in there. I think makes some sense. But other than that, I think those would be the only guys I would want to take from Kansas City.
Worthy has been playing better and due for an even bigger game. Last week alone had 2 more potential near touchdowns, one of which only got 1 foot down in bounds, and then drop one that seemed to be intended for Travis Kelce anyway. So we will certainly keep an eye on those Chiefs. But as Charch mentioned at the top, just 1 win away from clinching that 1 seed. So yeah, it would be tough business trying to get through that first round of the CHOPionship with a bunch of Chiefs on the roster. Not going to have that same problem though with the Baltimore Ravens. We got Lamar Jackson, who becomes the only player in NFL history now with 37 plus passing touchdowns and fewer than 4 interceptions through 15 games. And if I'm not mistaken, his 3 interceptions were all basically either dropped by his team or kind of the result of a miscommunication. Really can't even blame those on Lamar at this point. So, Charge, I mean, when we look at Lamar Jackson, he is the QB1 in fantasy points per game this season. How much exposure do you want to him in the CHOPionship?
Well, a lot. But while we're talking about dropped passes turned into interceptions, how about Kyle Pitts yesterday?
Man.
Oh, no.
Brutal.
Oh,
Deserve that.
Pitt.
To the Shadow Realm. Banish him to the Shadow Realm.
And Michael Penix picks up the INT in the box score that he so doesn't deserve. You just handing the ball to defenders. Anyway, Lamar Jackson is going to be extremely compelling in the CHOPionship. It's going to be hard to work around him, and he's going to be super chalky, and I don't care. If I've got 10 CHOPionship rosters, Lamar Jackson might be on 5 or 6 of the 10. I don't know how you work around him. Yesterday, Lamar cracked the only defense that had continually frustrated him, Pittsburgh, a team that, by the way, you may end up seeing in the playoffs again. With Jackson, you get the passing touchdowns. He's the NFL leader in passing touchdowns. I get the rushing production. He's the NFL leader in rushing yards. He can score more points in 2 games than other quarterbacks will score in 3 or 4 games. So even if the Ravens don't make it to the Super Bowl, I could still get 2 games out of Lamar Jackson and get the value of 3 or 4 from somebody else. And Baltimore could play 4 games. They're going to play in the wild card round. They could very well be playing in the Super Bowl. So you get the coveted 4th game potential. Boy, hard to work around Lamar Jackson. He might be the single most compelling player that you could roster in the CHOPionship format.
Really making an argument at this point, Chris, as the most fantasy-friendly quarterback ever. I mean, he still owns the #1 all-time season in fantasy points per game back in 2019. And what he's doing this year, man, actually ranks 7th. So not too far off that. Obviously has had, more relative playoff struggles over the years. But even in 6 career playoff games, man, 86.8 rushing yards per game. And he scored 3 touchdowns along the way. So it's one of those things, Chris, where even if you don't necessarily believe in Lamar and the Ravens getting over the hump, we've seen him when actually forced into a trailing game script and getting into comeback mode. And guess what? Tons of fantasy points usually follow.
Yeah, and that's why you would want to have a guy like Lamar on your roster, because if he's not going to get there as a passer, because I get it, Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, Rashad Bateman, that wouldn't be the pass catching core that I would want to have going into the playoffs. So I can see why, if you have some doubts about him as a passer, not just relative to his own skill, but just the guys that he's throwing to, okay, I think that makes some sense. But if he's now in the last 6 games, he's 6th in total quarterback runs, 5th in rushing yards just in these last 6 weeks. I mean, you get that rushing floor to pair with the booms that you can potentially get with him as a passer. And I don't know, guys. I mean, I remember folks on Saturday saying, well, because Derrick Henry was such a monster on the field, this is why that Lamar Jackson couldn't be the league's MVP. Right. But then on Sunday, watching Josh Allen and was it James Cook having to save his bacon because he got 100 yards and was part of the reason why that the Bills wound up winning. I don't know if that argument still is valid. So if you still have Derrick Henry still being able to help move the offense and Lamar Jackson doing what he can do as both a passer and a rusher, I think having a high exposure to him throughout the CHOPionship is probably one of the better strategies.
And hey, if you don't want to have all those associated pass catchers, maybe get it a little bit unique by going with Lamar and then not stacking any Ravens with him. Again, tons of options here in the ever great CHOPionship. So let's close it out with one more quarterback to look at, guys. Jared Goff, the QB3 since week 11 now at 25.1 fantasy points per game. Charge, is he a QB pick that you think could differentiate within the CHOPionship? Because like Mahomes, actually could be dealing with a first week off.
Yeah, that's an issue there. We'll want to watch that for sure. But yes, Jared Goff could be. And by the way, we were talking about the MVP. Jared Goff's working his way back into this conversation right now. He has played so well down the stretch. And with his defense giving up so many points in so many big games over the last 3 weeks, Jared Goff's had to step up and the volume has completely changed. You know, it was for almost all of the season. The problem with Jared Goff wasn't that he was playing well. The problem was he was throwing 24 passes in a game. Now we're seeing these passing totals into the 40s and even 50s per game. And Jared Goff's turning into a high upside quarterback that gives you the kinds of outcomes normally fantasy players only get with a rushing quarterback, a dual threat quarterback, which obviously Goff is not. He's playing really well like he has all year. He's surrounded by receiving weapons. You get Sun God, you get Sam Laporta, Jameson Williams, Tim Patrick surging here. And the Lions defense, so ratty that Goff's passing a ton, as I mentioned. Over the past 5 weeks, Goff has moved up from 27 pass attempts to 40 per game. And then the other sneaky thing on Goff, with David Montgomery out, the Lions can do a lot more inside the 5-yard line now, including throw the ball. And, you know, before that was pretty much mandatory Montgomery time inside the 5-yard line. Now they've got some more options near the stripe. So, yeah, Jared Goff, particularly if he does not have the week 1 bye, becomes a really compelling differentiator in the CHOPionship format.
It's like we haven't heard any MVP chatter for Goff since he had the 5-interception game in prime time against the Texans, which I realized was not ideal. You know, 5 interceptions for a quarterback is not what we want. But, man, even going back to that, 2 of those were tipped at the line. One of them was a Hail Mary. Like, if he had 3 picks and a couple strip sacks instead, are we really worrying about it? So, kind of a weird situation there, Chris. But, hey, could be also a situation where he is leaned on more, as Charge said, not expecting to have David Montgomery until maybe the divisional round. And I don't think it's really a coincidence that the Lions have had 2 of their top 4, drop back rates over expected over these past 2 weeks. So thoughts on Goff in this Lions passing game moving forward, Chris?
I think those are the 2 things that I'm going to be paying attention the most for. And like the push for the MVP, I think that's legitimate, because if you're now starting to take away more and more from the Lions, just entire team, whether it's the defense, whether now also removing David Montgomery and still seeing a guy like Jared Goff perform as a passer. And it's not just the fact that he can throw. And yes, the higher end drop back over expectation rates. Of course, we want to see our quarterbacks out there slinging it. But what he's doing under pressure, because y'all remember like how bad he was under pressure when he was with the Rams in the early stages of him with Detroit. It was, if you can get him under pressure, he completely flips from being this quarterback that can operate any passing game, but then of course once everything breaks down, he turns into essentially Jimmy Garoppolo or something like that, where everything starts to short circuit and he throws interceptions. That hasn't been the case so much this season. Top 12 in EPA per dropback once he is under duress. So I could see a scenario where if this continues to happen, let's say if in some way, shape, or form that the Detroit Lions and their offensive line starts to break down. Can't see it happening, but let's just say that it does. I would still have at least some shred of confidence that Jared Goff could keep the offense moving for the Lions. And if that's the case, if he can still do all the things that we've asked him to do or we've thought that he can do so far this season, and now he's also doing that, creating out of structure, I mean, yeah, you do have a legitimate quarterback on your hands. So I'd say MVP is not too far off, and especially for the CHOPionship, those pass catchers playing with an out-of-structure type Goff, hey, I mean, they can make some moves, and they can probably be the guy that you'd want to differentiate yourself in the CHOPionship.
And while we haven't seen a ton of the out of structure stuff from Goff, we have seen him forced to actually play in some negative game script for once, specifically in that Bills game where, yeah, Montgomery got injured. They were forced to play from a multiple touchdown deficit, and they continue to go right up and down the field, again, even with a depleted offense of sorts. So great stuff from Goff. Much more to talk about, though, ahead, guys, with some more cool stats. But first, a quick word to our friends over at Knockaround. All right, guys, I'm rocking the Buccaneers glasses today. Shout out Knockaround. Not going to lie, I, let my sweet mother, Mama Hartitz, have the Cowboy ones because I didn't think we'd be in a position where the Cowboys won a primetime game again and I'd have to wear their glasses. But rest assured, the Cowboys ones are cool as well. And, you can maybe see a lovely lady wearing them in, friendly Columbus, Ohio. So keep an eye out for that. But otherwise, feeling good about the Bucs as well. And you can check out all this and so much more over at knockaround.com for your holiday shopping. They are affordable, great looking in my humble opinion, and high quality at a less than $50 price point. UV 400 protection for your peepers is always important. And in addition to their officially licensed NFL collection, so many more great options where, again, really whatever floats your boat, they will have it only at knockaround.com. Just make sure you use code LIFE for free shipping.
Sunday. Time to suit up.
This seems like half zips, kind of quarter zip guy.
And sacrifice your body.
This is fun.
Because no matter how hard you football, it's easy to Sunday.
All right, guys, now we're going to talk about one of the biggest and best performers from last week, Mr. Jayden Daniels, who now has an NFL record 4 passing touchdowns in the final 30 seconds of the fourth quarter. Charge, Daniels a top 3 fantasy quarterback for you next year?
Oh, it's going to be close. We're right in there. What Daniels did yesterday should not be underestimated. Yes, the loss of Jalen Hurts played a sizable factor in the outcome, the win and loss, but Kenny Pickett did not allow Daniels to throw 5 touchdown passes against a Philly defense that had allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks since week 6. I mean, this was a monumental achievement, a game with significant, tangible playoff ramifications for the Eagles, and he still beat them. And the intangibles for Jayden Daniels are immense. He learned he can rally his team to outscore a quality opponent 22-6 in the fourth quarter. Daniels learned he can do it hamstrung by the middling talents of Jamison Crowder, Olamide Zacchaeus, and Daniels learned he can single-handedly carry his offense. Brian Robinson had 24 yards. This win went through the arm of Jayden Daniels. We already knew Daniels was good. These are the kinds of games that make a quarterback great. And you phrased this question, is he a top 3 fantasy quarterback next year? Lamar Jackson's going to go number 1 in almost every fantasy league. Josh Allen will probably be 2. I think it gets pretty interesting when we get to Jalen Hurts versus Jayden Daniels at 3 and 4. I think that's going to be a back and forth battle for a lot of people. With Jalen Hurts, you get the comfort of knowing you got 12 tush-push touchdowns coming. That's pretty compelling. Daniels, it's going to be interesting because we know how good Jalen Hurts is. I feel like I know where his top end is. I don't know where Jayden Daniels could go. I mean, he could be a whole step better as a sophomore next year, and that'll be a lot of fun to watch this offseason.
Only other quarterback I think could be in the conversation is Joe Burrow, but he just doesn't have the same rushing floor or ceiling at this point. I mean, Daniels, guys, only quarterbacks averaging more rushing yards per game since 2000 are Lamar Jackson and Justin Fields. So truly is a gaudy, ceiling on that side of things. And Chris, I don't know, God forbid the Commanders have more than one great wide receiver out there next year.
See, and that's the tough part, and that's why I would break ties in favor of Jalen Hurts, because he'll have A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, and then, of course, like Dallas Goedert, or like they'll have enough pass catchers that we can see a guy like Hurts getting pulled into a good passing script, because Hurts is somewhat, I would say he's a lesser passer than Jayden Daniels at this point. I'll say that. But the thing for the Commanders, that's their problem for the offseason, is that they don't have a ton of cap space as of right now. I think they have the least amount of cap space in the league. That's according to overthecap.com. And so if we're really just relying on draft capital in order to secure another wide receiver for the Commanders, I'd be hard pressed to say whether or not they're going to be the types of the offense that we're going to want to target. I think you're going to have the high end production from Jayden Daniels. I mean, to both your points, fourth in total quarterback rushes throughout the season, 230 passing yards per game. That's right above the league average. So he's right there in terms of he has that floor, and of course the ceiling performances are going to be there. But if there's not going to be one of those like direct or intentional investments into the wide receiver core, I think Hurts is probably going to be the QB3, and then Daniels just shortly right after that for 2025.
Let's add Emeka Egbuka to this Commanders offense and see what happens, guys.
Hey,
Gen Z, Robert Woods, that's my comp, and I'm sticking to it. But regardless,
more Ohio State wide receivers? Come on.
I'm not. Just draft wide receivers from Ohio State and LSU, and you probably will not go wrong out there. So final point here with Jayden Daniels. We'll see what 2025 has in store, but either way, just an incredible 2024. Only Cam Newton and Justin Herbert at this point have averaged more fantasy points per game than Daniels among all rookie quarterbacks ever. Yeah, so pretty freaking great stuff from the number 2 overall pick. Also great stuff from the former number 1 overall pick recently, Bryce Young, guys. He has 226 total yards and 3 touchdowns yesterday. And Charch, I mean, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and we're like, okay, maybe Bryce Young, you could say, has been playing better than CJ Stroud. But you know what? The sample size keeps on growing, man.
It does. Look, I think for a month and a half, Bryce Young has looked better than CJ Stroud. Young's development has happened in distinct stages. Stage number 1, which is about 2 months ago, quit doing dumb stuff. So we've stopped, Bryce Young has stopped giving away games. He's stopped making really eye-rollingly bad plays, interceptions, taking dumb sacks. So that was step 1. We quit doing dumb stuff. Step number 2 for Bryce Young, now we back up about 6 weeks. Pocket poise. Suddenly I'm looking at a guy who looks comfortable in the pocket, who's making his reads, that isn't breaking off plays and running when he doesn't need to run. He is running and is running when he does need to run, extending plays. The pocket poise, the intangibles starting to happen. That was stage 2. Stage 3, becoming productive. And that is, now we're getting deep. We're getting close to now. The completion percentage going up. He's starting to throw touchdowns reliably. I believe 6 straight games with passing touchdowns. The ADOT is increasing. So he was 5.5 yards per throw in the first half of the season. Now he's at 7. Doesn't seem like a lot, but that moves you from near the very bottom of the league to roughly the middle of the league at 7 yards per pass. That's a good step forward for Bryce Young. And then step 4 is happening now. Win games. The Panthers they've been losing all these close games to great games like Kansas City and Tampa and Philly, and they were taking these teams right to the wire. Now they're winning games like yesterday, and Bryce Young is turning into a winner. Head coach Dave Canales will not win Coach of the Year. Kevin O'Connell is going to win Coach of the Year, but he should get others receiving votes. Let's give Dave Canales some other votes in there. He has done an amazing job working with Bryce Young, resurrecting his career, and putting the Panthers in a spot where this offseason, they don't have to go quarterback, which seems shocking. They can go offensive line help. Panthers ranked dead last in ESPN's pass block win rate. Let's stick with Bryce Young this offseason. Let's improve the offensive line, maybe get him a little more help, a succession plan for Adam Thielen. And if all those things happen, we're going to be drafting Bryce Young, still like round 11 or 12 of our fantasy drafts, but as a viable second quarterback on our fantasy rosters next year.
Yeah.
Don't want to get completely carried away, but this early Panthers tenure is starting to have a little bit of vibes like, the first year or two of Jared Goff with the Lions, just in terms of the culture they're building with the young ascending quarterback. So a little bit different stages of their careers. I get it. But Chris, either way, man, hard not to give Bryce Young some credit, especially considering, man, still not dealing with a ton of resources. Looking at overthecap.com, the Panthers have the second fewest $2025 allocated to their wide receiver and tight end rooms ahead of next season. Ted McMillan, number 7. I mean, there's some options, man, where we could all of a sudden get things looking good in a hurry.
Yeah, and actually I flipped that from our Commanders segment. Commanders have the 6th most, and it's the Panthers that have some of the fewest dollars available. So yeah, good investments, potential good investments for Jayden Daniels. But for Bryce Young, let's see how things work out. So because to Charch's point, having Bryce Young as, let's say, a high-end QB2 going into 2025 completely makes sense, because in his 6, 7, 8 games since he's been back, his best performances have been against the Bucs and the Cardinals. I mean, the Chiefs, yes, he looked good from a fantasy standpoint there, around 16 fantasy points, so that's serviceable if you needed to get by throughout bye weeks. But going up against the Broncos, he looked pretty frustrating. The Eagles decimated. The Cowboys had him looking like he was taking a step back. I mean, all teams that can fire on you when they need to from a blitz and create pressure and create havoc up at the front of the line of scrimmage. So let's see how the offseason looks for them, and if they can make a couple of changes up front, and if Canales still is able to start to continue to integrate some of his concepts into the passing game, we can see a guy like Bryce Young take a step forward. I kind of liken him to how Tua started out, honestly, where it was, we don't know how things are going to be for Tua, like once he got into the league with the injuries that he sustained in college, and then afterwards you add in one of the better pass catching cores around him, the explosives start to happen, and then Tua now is one of the better passers in this league. So I could see a scenario like that for Bryce Young, where you get an explosive pass catcher, you pair him with one of those, have a guy like Dave Canales like operating the 1s and 2s behind it. I think that can happen for a guy like Bryce Young in 2025.
Let's move on to another Week 16 star, Jonathan Taylor, who had more fantasy points with 39.8 than his previous 4 games combined. So, Charch, maybe, really helped a lot of people out there advance in their, consolation brackets.
Consolation brackets only, sadly enough. So I'm watching this game. I'm a Viking fan, and we don't have like Lombardis to polish or anything here in Minnesota. So we hang on to little things like Adrian Peterson's got the single game rushing record, 298 yards. You know that. We're very excited about that here. And with about a third of the game left, I'm starting to sweat that record. Because Jonathan Taylor, we're at 7 minutes left in the third quarter, and he's got 180 rushing yards. I'm thinking, oh, don't take my Adrian Peterson rushing record away from me, please. And he didn't. But it was still obviously a great game. How good was Taylor? Anthony Richardson threw 11 passes in the game, and they still scored 37 points. It was vintage Jonathan Taylor, the kind of runs we saw in that magical 2021 season. And it helped a lot that his offensive line was just blowing open gaping holes. Taylor enjoyed a stunning 4.1 yards before contact in this game. That will help the old average right there. And that was the most yards before contact in any game since that 2021 season that I referenced earlier. The Tennessee run defense started the season strong, but they've gotten rocked lately, including by Jonathan Taylor here. And Taylor single-handedly powered fantasy teams into championships, if you survived last week, into the championship for next week. And that next week brings us to the Giants. That's your opponent. Bijan Robinson just ran for 94 yards and 2 scores, but I'll note Bijan was only at 4.2 yards per carry. Giants, I wouldn't say have exactly been a doormat against the run. They kind of limited Derrick Henry, 67 yards 2 weeks ago, although Henry rested for a lot of the second half of that game. Week before that, they limited Alvin Kamara to 44 yards. Still, I think looking ahead next week against the Giants, Taylor, running back, 9, 10, I'm going to guess, somewhere like that in my rankings. Sound about right?
Seems so. I mean, if he, again, was able to add the long touchdown he should have had the previous week before he dropped the football at the 1 yard line, again, the fantasy points would be looking even better. But moral of the story here, Chris, is this looks like vintage JT, and maybe we didn't, just add enough, I guess, credence to the idea that he wasn't 100%. People forget, man, high ankle sprain, grade 3 back in week 4 this season, looking great now.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those where it's more of the offense that stunk around him that was giving us more bad vibes around Jonathan Taylor, because since we've had so many questions about Anthony Richardson as a passer since he came back as the starter, that kind of lends itself to us questioning how the rest of the Colts offense looks. But still, on the season, Jonathan Taylor has the 6th highest rushing rate of any running back so far. I mean, that's so with him having the workload and also going up against the Titans defense that just this past week got ripped up by Chase Brown. Brian Robinson tagged them for over 100 yards before they went into their bye. I mean, it's easy enough to say that the matchup set up for him. And as long as the workload was going to be there for Jonathan Taylor, which it had been so far throughout this season, it lent itself to one of those fireworks types of weeks. And I think, to Charcher's point, going up against the Giants in week 17, if you got them on your roster and you've made it this far in the playoffs, you have at least a mid to high end like RB1 like for week 17.
Feeling good about JT, but we're feeling great about Mr. Ja'Marr Chase, who continues to vie for that Triple Crown Award. Would join Jerry Rice, Sterling Sharp, Cooper Kupp, and Steve Smith as the only wide receivers to do that in the last 50-plus years. Charge, is Ja'Marr Chase your 101 for 2025?
Yep, right now he is. He's 101. I think it looks like a great opportunity for him because he gives you the perfect combination of proven upside and the safety you want in round number 1. For me, I add risk into my drafts the deeper I get, because into the drafts, into the mid rounds, the bottom rounds, because those picks are worth less. I put more safety at the top of my drafts. And so Ja'Marr Chase, so safe. His quarterback, Joe Burrow, young, elite. He's not going to get worse. His coach, Zach Taylor, does an amazing job of scheming the ball to Ja'Marr Chase every game. Chase has at least 6 targets in every game since week number 2. And that's a little bit of a distinction on Justin Jefferson, who we'll talk more about later in this show. And like once a month, JJ sort of like disappears from the game plan. And that never really happens here with Ja'Marr Chase. I worry about the pending probable offseason loss of T. Higgins. And maybe, Chris, you know more about where this is headed than I do. You're in Cincinnati. When I look at the games without T. Higgins, Chase gains a lot of variance to his output, good and bad. Over the last 2 years, Chase's 2 biggest fantasy point days in each of the last 2 seasons were when T. Higgins didn't play, but he also gets the bad games without Higgins. Higgins missed 5 games this year, and Chase's 3 worst fantasy games were all in those 5 games without Higgins. So it creates a lot of variance. I'll maybe factor that in, but as it stands right now, today, in mid to late December, if I had the first pick in my fantasy draft next season, Ja'Marr Chase is my guy.
The Higgins factor certainly will be something we'll track all offseason long. But, Chris, it does seem like, again, when you're looking at Jettas, Chase, Puka Nacua, and these guys, tiebreaker, it's just kind of Joe Burrow.
Yeah, and I think that's where we have to make that consideration, because it's not just the talent, but also the situation. Bengals so far these last 3 seasons have been number 1 in pass rate over expectation in neutral situations. And of course, being tied to one of the better pocket passers in the league. I just think about this, guys. Like 2021, Joe Burrow took 70 sacks in 2021. His pressure to sack rate is now at like bottom 10 this season. So he not only has the quarterback playing well, Ja'Marr Chase has an environment so that they're always going to be looking to push the ball down the field. And of course, with Ja'Marr Chase earning the majority of the targets when he's out there on the field, I mean, fourth in target share so far throughout this season. I mean, he should be considered as the 101 for 2025.
That is ridiculous, Chris. He did, in fact, get to 70 when you include the playoffs. Happy he's no longer on pace to get that many. Let's talk about Ja'Marr Chase's LSU teammate, because if we had to pick someone else that maybe could go 101 next year, it would be Justin Jefferson. Now, the fastest player to rack up 7,000-plus receiving yards and 40-plus receiving touchdowns in his career. So, again, Church, we just said Chase 101. Jefferson 102 for you?
Yeah, I think he's probably sitting at 102 right now. Obviously, it's if the Vikings re-sign Sam Darnold or franchise tag him, although I don't think Sam Darnold would be very happy if you did that. But Sam Darnold's got to come back. J.J. McCarthy, I mean, we felt like coming into the draft, he was at least fairly pro-ready. Now, missing this whole rookie year with the knee injury, a major bummer. I mean, let me ask this, Ian and Chris, for each of you. And this topic is hotly debated in the Twin Cities where I am. Would you sign Sam Darnold to a market deal this offseason? And let's say that's like 4 years, $150 million, $160 million, maybe more. would you sign Sam Darnold, or would you roll the dice that you got it right on J.J. McCarthy in last year's draft?
Chris?
If it's between those two, I'd say you roll the dice on JJ. I don't think I could do a market resetting deal for Sam Darnold.
I'm leaning the same way. Look, I trust whatever Kevin O'Connell ends up thinking at the end of the day here. Let's just give him the benefit of the doubt with it. But the biggest team building advantage in football is having something close to elite quarterback on that rookie deal. And we've just seen Jefferson, Addison, and this system already prop up someone like Nick Mullins, who, is averaging 8.8 yards per attempt on not exactly the smallest sample size over these last 2 years as well. But Charch, you're the one bleeding purple out here. So what say you?
Well, we've already burned through one of J.J. McCarthy's cheap rookie years, right? And from the bench. Sure. So I've lost one of those already, unfortunately. And Sam Darnold is not going to win MVP, but he's going to be others getting votes in MVP, and you're just going to let him walk. I don't know. I'm leaning towards giving him the deal, a market deal, but I don't know. This thing plays out, and I think ultimately you're right, Ian. If Kevin O'Connell is on board with J.J. McCarthy, he's earned the benefit of the doubt at this point because of what he's done with this quarterback so far. And maybe I'm just being a jaded Viking fan here, permanently damaged by 6 straight NFC Championship losses. So take this with a grain of salt. But I feel like Justin Jefferson is a step under Ja'Marr Chase, and he's in that same tier with Amon-Ra St. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Puka Nacua, maybe Nico Collins, tier 2 wide receivers you're going to take. Front end of your draft next year, maybe a pick number 2 for Justin Jefferson overall.
97 receiving yards per game in his young career. That is the most in NFL history. So certainly doing the right stuff. And whether it's 102, 103, 104, pretty sure we're not going to need more than one hand to count the number of guys you're taking ahead of Jettas next year. So good stuff, guys. Now, before we keep on keeping on, a quick word to our friends over at Game Time. Fellas, we all know there's nothing like being at a game in person, especially around the holidays. And let me tell you what, got a couple tickets still brewing in those best ball streets. And if we get lucky on one of them, I'll be booking that trip to Pasadena to watch the world famous Ohio State Buckeyes take on the Oregon Ducks in the Rose Bowl. So fingers crossed for that one. But of course, if that comes to fruition, I will be using Game Time. It is my go-to for finding amazing tickets, not just for sports, but also for concerts and shows too. I was actually scrolling through the Game Time app the other day, and I came across my favorite feature called Game Time Picks. And fellas, it is a total game changer. Game Time Picks curates your experience, showing you the best deals on great seats, and they make it so easy. It is a no-brainer, people. Seriously, Game Time takes all the guesswork out of buying tickets, and you can check it out for yourself by downloading the Game Time app, creating an account, and using the code LIFE for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply, but again, create an account and redeem code LIFE, L-I-F-E, for $20 off. Download Game Time today, because what time is it? Game time. 2 more stats to get to, fellas. First up, Cooper Kupp averaging just 2.7 PPR points per game over the last 2 weeks. Chris, looking ahead to 2025, man, how much does this rough patch make you think twice about drafting him again?
It's definitely going to make me think twice about it. And it's not just the fact that he has been getting fewer targets than Puka Nacua. I mean, Nacua really has taken over the wide receiver 1 job. Just the offense hasn't been as high flying of an offense that we expected it to be. Drop back over expectation rate has been negative in like 6 straight games so far. Kyron Williams really being featured. And just let me read off these stats real quick from their game against the Jets. 14 drives, and here are 7 of those drives. 11 plays, 6 minutes, punt. 10 plays, 6 minutes, and an interception. 15 plays, 6 minutes off the clock, and a field goal. 14 plays with a turnover on downs. 13 plays with a field goal. 11 plays with a field goal. This is one of the most boring games to watch. And so if you thought that going into this game, Cooper Kupp was going to be one of the guys that you wanted to target, especially going up against the Jets defense, it just wasn't going to feature enough passing in order for him to get there. So I still think he's going to be in the middle tier of wide receivers, just with him operating more on the interior. So I would say that he's more of like a low-end wide receiver 2 somewhere in there versus him being in the like fringe top 12 that he's been in years past.
Puka has certainly been looking better. In Kupp's defense, he's another guy like JT where he had that early season high ankle sprain. Maybe that still is limiting him. But Charge, looking ahead to 2025, Kupp will be turning 32 in June. And it's not a complete given Matthew Stafford's going to be back. They did retool his contract to essentially make it a one-year deal earlier this offseason. So do you still think Kupp's going to be, having a conversation, something to say about being a top 12 wide receiver?
No, I think he's out of this conversation. And I think yesterday was really telling. I don't want to put too much into one game, but here you're playing the Jets. They got Sauce Gardner on one side, right? They've got DJ Reed on the other side, and they're missing their epic slot cornerback, Michael Carter, one of the best cornerbacks in the league at any position. He's not there for that game. And yet Sean McVay still didn't exploit that matchup. I mean, in years past in this situation, Kupp would have been sitting on like a 14-target game. Yesterday, all we got were 3 targets for Kupp against a backup slot corner. I mean, it begs the question, what does Sean McVay know about Kupp? Is he onto something ahead of what we know and something we're just starting to learn right now? So next up for Kupp is Arizona. And Eric, the Cardinals have a sneaky, competent secondary, and their best cornerback is their slot cornerback, a kid named Garrett Williams that most people don't know anything about, but he's giving up just a 59% completion rate in his coverage. And in his coverage on a per game basis, he's giving up 2 catches for 19.5 yards. That's it. So this is another tricky matchup. I think this week I'm going to have Kupp ranked at like wide receiver 25. I'm not drafting him anywhere. I think I'll be drafting Cooper Kupp next year in like round 8, round 9. I don't think he's going to be anything close to what we've seen before based on what we've seen here at the tail end of this year.
One guy we'll certainly have ranked ahead in week 17 and in 2025 drafts is Jaguars wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr., leading all rookies in receiving yards and touchdowns. And at this point, Chris really has been historically elite. Only rookie wide receivers with 16 plus PPR points per game since 1998. Randy Moss, OBJ, Jamar Chase, Anquan Bolden, Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson, Michael Thomas, Mike Evans, and the pair of LSU teammates now, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. So what round does BTJ go in 2025 drafts, Mr. Chris?
I'd say middle of the second round, probably like wide receiver 12, somewhere in there. I would say that's where I'd probably put him. Just looking at the way that he's been used, and of course we're expecting the offensive turnaround. No more Doug Peterson, change in that offensive staff. Trevor Lawrence getting back there, and of course less of Gabe Davis and potentially no more Christian Kirk as well. So having more of the wide receiver group to himself, Brian Thomas Jr., mid-range wide receiver, like round 2-ish wide receiver. I think that seems fair for how he's ended his freshman year.
Charge, give me your 30-second elevator pitch on why you should draft Brian Thomas Jr. in 2025.
In the middle of round 2 is exactly right. He's wide receiver 5 right now. In 1 week, he went from wide receiver 9 to wide receiver 5 pending tonight's action. I think he's going to go at like wide receiver 7 in most of our rankings into the preseason. If he had a premier quarterback, he'd go end of first round into the first round. But as it stands, Trevor Lawrence still getting enough done. Brian Thomas looks special, and it's only going to get better in year number 2. Yeah, round 2 for Brian Thomas looks great.
Man, imagine if Ben Johnson maybe says, see you later, Chicago. Let me get down to that Florida sunshine, takes over the Jags. Jaguars fans can dream at least. But guys, that's going to wrap it up from us. Make sure you tune back tomorrow, though. Myself, Dwayne McFarland, going over all the sheesh and utilization goodness that you could ask for. So for Charge, for Chris, for producer Kelsey, for producer Matt, I'm Ian. Thanks again for tuning in to the Fantasy Life Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.